Hi. I just finished my story for the week. This one is called Heaven is Boring, and I really struggled with this one. I think it was like the most difficult story to write in a long time. Interestingly enough, it was the easiest to type, so to say. So, like, I wasn't really struggling with the writing of the story itself, but then once I did write it, it was just so not working. So, yeah. Anyways, I did figure out a way to do make it work in the end, and I'm done. So that's why my name is Simon, and this is what we do when we don't write. Let's get into the story. First of all, if you haven't read it yet, check it out before you watch this. I don't want to spoil anything because I'm gonna read some excerpts and stuff. You can read it on my website, simonvanlaak.de, or on Substack. Yeah, so this story kind of came from the fantasies I had about kind of running away from it all, right? I do have those from time to time, and it's always something about either like some form of manual labor job, like working as a fisherman, or as this story, and like working in a cute little cafe by the ocean. And yeah, this is what this story is about. It starts with the main character driving a motorcycle through the south of Spain, but then actually breaking down and being kind of stuck in this small village and getting to know the people there. And then, when the motorcycle is fixed, spoiler, decides to stay in that town actually, even though in the first place didn't want to really stay there. Was always thinking about kind of the life after the travels and something else that the main character had to do. And when I came up with this idea for the story, I was like, oh wow, this is a great idea. It works for a short story. I have that end and everything. But as I did start to write it, I kind of noticed that problem of a lack of conflict. So in the beginning, I wasn't really concerned about it too much because I wanted to write more of a feel-good type story rather than the last two, which were very kind of intense. And even though there were some funny parts, they were mainly kind of, I don't want to say sad themes, but wasn't like all flowers and beautiful and everything, right? So I had this idea with wanting to write a story that is more of a happy vibe. And I think this is already kind of where the problem started, because I didn't just start writing something because I felt like writing it, but I was writing kind of with a goal in mind. And I think that's already kind of the first problem that I encountered with this. It's like when you already know exactly what you want to achieve, you can't really discover that anymore in the story, and it becomes more of kind of writing an advertisement than really writing a story where you already have that goal in mind of what the story is supposed to evoke in the reader. And then it's not really going to work, I feel, because you more start to plan rather than explore while you're writing. And the second problem I had with this story was that which, like, I heard this advice a lot before, but this time I really experienced it, which is write about things you know, or write what you know. And I didn't know anything in the story except like the underlying idea of wanting to run away, or like feeling like you need to do something and these kind of things. But I know nothing about motorcycle riding, and I know nothing about living in a small city, even living in big cities my whole life. Don't know much about living by the beach, don't know much about cafes and mechanics and like all these different things. So that was, I think, really kind of the second downfall of this story, why it really didn't work. And after having worked on it for like 1 or 2 days, I came up with this idea of adding the conflict of the new job. So the main character kind of has these nightmares about starting a new job, and he's on his way to Barcelona where he was going to start a new job, and it's kind of an important job to him, and trying to think about this conflict of, well, what is actually like making us feel important, and comparing this kind of big business job management whatever bullshit, right, to working in a small cafe in a tiny town by the sea and helping out the fishermen and these kind of things, and really trying to make that comparison between what is kind of paid well and what is actually important work, right? And that was an interesting concept, I thought, and something I've been thinking about as well, where it's like, well, just because you get paid a lot doesn't really mean it's a meaningful job to you. And I then thought, okay, this is some conflict I can work with, and I can put it kind of in between as these nightmares that I thought that first nightmare worked really well. But then again, I had this kind of thing of like, okay, so now he is in that town, the motorcycle is broken down, but why doesn't he just take a bus? I feel like any kind of problem that I was able to come up was just so easily resolved that I had to come up, with new problems and reasons why they couldn't be resolved that way. And I just kind of got lost in that, right? Because the conflicts were so meaningless, was rather logistical problems than really like character conflicts. So I'm gonna read a piece here, which is then how I kind of figured out how the story would work, or this piece of writing at this point, because it's not much a story anymore, which is actually discussing the lack of conflict in the story and using these kind of inserts and interruptions as kind of a commentary on the story I wrote. So then the story becomes kind of the B plot of the piece. And what it's actually about is, why are in our fantasies never any conflicts, and why are we always dreaming about a life that actually when we would be living it would be kind of boring. So this is what is almost at the end of the piece I'm gonna read now, and it starts with kind of the end of an excerpt of the story, and yeah, let's just get into it. A few kilometers outside of the town, I stopped and looked back at the town. I turned my bike around and headed back towards the town. I had forgotten what I was looking for on that journey. The travel forced him to stop his the travel forced him to... That doesn't make any sense. Anyway, the traveler forced to stop his travel spends his time in the small village and learned to enjoy life there. When allowed to travel again, he instead decides to stay. Ugh, such a cliche. That is the problem with dreams. There's no conflict, no hardship, no struggle, no problem. When we fantasize about a different life, our ability to worry somehow evaporates. We have no clue what could ever go wrong in that imagined life. And that is what I've learned from this story. That while it's all just fantasy, I am really actually pretty bad at fantasy, and that has consequences. If all my fantasies about the future, my ideas how things could be, a lack of conflict will never be achievable. And while they do contain achievable parts, such as learning how to ride a motorcycle, taking it on a trip along the Spanish coastline, and spending a month in a small Spanish town, that actual fantasy is not about those achievable parts. It's about everything else. It's about non-existent problems, or if problems do exist, how they resolve themselves. With my head in the clouds, I can't watch where I'm going. the fog starts to be so dense that I might stray off the path into the wilderness without ever noticing. I wanted to write a story about feeling good. Here it is. The big problem, it's boring. So when you take one thing with you, it's this. Next time you're daydreaming and fantasizing about life, how life could be, do this super quick and simple reality check. Is my fantasy boring? And I promise you, the answer is simple and clear, yes. So really then diving deep into this idea of, well, if the meaning of life, and let's just agree on that for 1 second for sake of argument, is being happy, we're actually quite bad at being happy as humans, I guess. Like, the only way I can predict if I was gonna be happy doing something is when I imagine doing that and then try to feel what that imaginative world, kind of what emotions that brings. But that's not really a good way to figure out if you're going to be happy or not, right? And all of these kind of ideas and fantasies that I am having about the future, they're just super unrealistic, right? And they're so bad at predicting if I was gonna like that life, if I would live that life, right? Thinking about if I want to study, what would I study? And just reading the syllabus gives you no idea of what the actual day-to-day of studying that subject is going to be, right? Are you going to have a lot of homework? Are you going to meet friends there that are fun? Are you, going to be interested in the subjects? Is there much homework? And, are you going to be reading a lot? Or is it mainly being all these important parts of what that life's going to be like? Also, the place you're going to live and whatnot. Are your neighbors going to be loud, right? Those things is not the things that you're thinking about in these fantasies, but those are actually the key drivers if you are going to enjoy that life then, right? So I thought this kind of discrepancy, this distance between the two was fairly interesting. But yeah, that was kind of the only way I could figure out how to still use that story, because the story itself was kind of just flat, just without any depth. And I think really what I've learned from this story is that when I do want to write something, it has to be real. It has to bring truth, and it can't just be something I'm just dreaming about. There can be parts of that in the story, and I think that worked in the past for me, but it's always got to be rooted in real experiences. And that's kind of where the good material is coming from. And that's also motivating me now in the next week to look more at the things that are happening to me, maybe take notes during the day-to-day of things that were interesting, write down little quotes or things I picked up on, and really focus on kind of writing about the experiences I'm gonna make this week, and also try to have some interesting experiences, right? And not just write about like eating breakfast or whatever. So that's kind of my goal for this week, and really hoping that the next story can be much more rooted in that reality. And I think it's also a good failing that way with this story, because I did write in the past about super realistic, which is kind of the derailed all-nighter story, kind of a mix between reality and fantasy, which was the airplane beer stories. And now I'm on the other side of the spectrum, which is like all fantasy and almost no reality, and that really didn't work. And I think of those three, the best story was really the one that was rooted most in my actual experiences. So I think focusing on that is the way to go with the next story. And yeah, maybe using some of this yes and technique I used in the airplane beer story, but really focusing on what really happened and analyzing kind of emotions that I went through. And yeah, that's kind of my focus on next week's story. Let's talk about my recommendation of this week. I've been reading this book, The Penguin Book of Spanish Short Stories, edited by Margaret Jull Costa. I put a little start on there. Thanks, Pilar, for that. I got this book at La Central in Raval in Barcelona because I was in Barcelona. I wanted to read Spanish stories, right? And Catalan stories. There's also some Galician stories in here, which are cool as well. First big problem I was having with this book is the way the stories are ordered. It's by, what did the author write? Chronologically by birth of the person that wrote it or something like that. Basically chronological by time, and starting with, of course, then the oldest story in the book, which is the most distant to reality. So I thought some of those just didn't really connect with me. And then what I did was kind of jump back and forth between the back of the book and the front of the book, trying to, going both ways. Because it feels weird going backwards in a book. That's why I did go from the front sometimes. Yeah. Let's actually first read an excerpt of my favorite stories of the ones that I wrote so far, which is from Leopoldo Alas, Clarin, if I pronounce that correctly. It's called Duet for Tooth Coughs. Really fun story. Really a focus on kind of solitude, also in traveling. And it's about two people that are in hotel rooms. They're like not right next to each other, there's one in between, but super close. And they hear each other coughing and kind of have a conversation through the coughs in a way. And I thought it was a really cool description of what it feels like to solo travel sometimes, where you are amongst a lot of other people that might want to connect, but you're also so far away from them at the same time because you don't know them, you haven't talked to them yet. And at this scene, they're both standing on the balcony, kind of looking into the nightlife, can't really fall asleep. And I thought it was such a good thing, how it's written. So let me start right here. If I were suddenly to feel very ill, if I were to cry out so as not to die alone, that smoker would hear me, the woman thinks, clutching a thick, perfumed white shawl to her delicate, fragile breast. There's a balcony between us, so that must be room 36. This morning, when I had get up to call the maid, because she didn't hear the bell, I saw an elegant pair of boots in the corridor outside that door. A distant light suddenly vanished, with an effect like lightning, which you only notice when it's gone. That's the beacon at the end of El Puental beach going out, thinks the shape in the room 36, rather gloomy, feeling even lonelier in the night. One less person to keep watch, another one falling asleep. The steamships in the harbor, the big belly barges at the dock, just near the hotel, now resemble shadows among the shadows. In the darkness, the water takes center stage and glitters faintly, like an optical illusion, like the glow of an extinguishing light retained by retina, an illusionary phosphorescence in the gloom, all the more painful for being incomplete. It seems that both the idea of light and the imagination struggling to make sense of the vague shapes need help in making out what little can be seen below. The barges move only slightly more perceptible than the minute hand on the big clock, but now and then they bump against each other with a soft, sad, monotonous twok, accompanied by the sea in the distance, like the clicking cry of a barn owl trying to impose silence. A town of businessmen and bathers is sleeping. The whole house is sleeping. The shape in room 36 senses and angers in that silent, shadowy solitude. Suddenly, as if he had heard a great explosion, he's shaken by the sound of a dry cough, repeated 3 times, like the gentle call of an early rising quail. It comes from his right, 2 balconies along. Room 36 looks over and notices the shape that is only slightly darker than the surrounding darkness, the same shade of black as the barges down below. The cough of someone ill, the cough of a woman, and room 36 shudders and thinks of his own situation. So like atmospheric, right? You can really go into that darkness, that standing out there at the balcony window in the hotel room and looking across the landscapes and noticing all these different things. I thought that was like so well written and super fun to read, to go into kind of that mood of being alone in a dark night and kind of lost and everything. That really resonated with me. I really liked that short story. One thing I did kind of struggle with was that because both the characters don't have any names, as you notice, it's always like the shape in room 36 or the woman or these kind of things. You do get a bit lost between the room numbers. It's like 36 and 32, and then there's room 34 in between. And it took me a while to realize why it's always the even numbers, because probably the other numbers are on the other side of the corridor, then they don't have the same view into the harbor. But yeah, that's maybe the only thing I would change. But it also gives the whole thing way more anonymity, which is really cool and really adds to that atmosphere. So I really like that story. One thing I did notice when reading a lot of short stories, I've been reading at least one a day now. I don't like short stories anymore. I'm really struggling with starting a new short story because it seems like such a huge commitment now, because you have to really allow yourself to enter into that different world. And especially when you read these kind of stories, you never know where they're taking place, what time it kind of is in years and decades, right? It's like one story here, there's a guy on the tram and you're like, okay, so what was that like, right? Because it's not like you can't just imagine it in the world you're in right now, and you don't really have any visual aids. So kind of the big struggle with short stories for me now is you spend so much time setting the stage, introducing the characters, so much exposition in the beginning to really get the reader into that mood and see the scene. It's already like a third of the story, right? Or what also a lot of other short stories do is they just don't mention that at all, and they kind of introduce it throughout. But then as a reader in the beginning, you have no visual sense of the story. It's also abstract. And maybe, somebody mentions a count, right? Or a baron, and all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, okay, I'm in a totally different time. Because, in my day-to-day, I don't talk about any counts or barons, so it must be a different time. Well, that is really fun if you're reading a short story from time to time and you're really in the mood and kind of discovering that time or that place. I feel like just a random collection of short stories puts that like additional effort into figuring out when and where you are. While, for example, when I was reading Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, which are all horror and kind of gothic, scary, they're all set in kind of similar gloomy atmospheres and in a time that's fairly distant to today. Like The Cask of Amontillado, one of my favorite short stories, right? Sets in Venice in like a wine cellar, which is a scene you can get into really quickly without needing to explain a lot of stuff. And even the explanation that does happen in the beginning is super exciting because you're like right in the middle of the story and the narrator is just so well written. And with that collection of short stories from Edgar Allan Poe, they're all kind of similar. So when you pick up the book, you already can get into that kind of mood. And I think the one I read also had pictures, which is so helpful with short stories. Like they're here, there's like no picture at all, right? So you don't have any anchor points. So I think that is something that's really important for short stories, is just have one cover picture that's really sets the mood. And I think that's also something I'm gonna focus on in the future, is really be able to set that mood that way. But the other thing is just like, oh, I don't have the energy to get into another short story sometimes. So what I think I'm gonna do more in the next stories is try to have a similar narrator and a similar environment, so that when you are reading like 2 or 3 of these stories, you already know what kind of mood you're in, and really try to focus more on a collection of short stories that are similar, rather than jumping around a lot. And then I think that can really work well as short stories, if you just have a collection of short stories, but they're the same narrator, the same time, the same place, or at least a similar place, right? Then I think it's much easier to get into it, rather than like in these kind of anthologies where it's all over the place, right? So yeah, that's my idea on this book. Honestly, I don't know if I can recommend the book. I do really recommend this short story. Maybe, no, I lost the, maybe you can just find it. It's Duet for Two Calves by Leopoldo Alas, Clarin. Maybe you can find it that way. I am not through the book yet. Maybe there's a few others that I really like, to the point where I would recommend picking it up just for reading the couple of stories. Yeah. But so far, I didn't really resonate with most of the stories. Probably also because I mainly read the old ones, which is just in such a different time. And I'm more looking for kind of modern, contemporary stuff lately. Cool cover though. Really colorful and fun. Yeah. Thank you very much for joining me here. Check out my story, Heaven is Boring, on either Substack, where this is called What We Do When We Don't Write. So look it up there, or you can also just look up my name, Simon van Laak. Also on my website, simonvanlaak.de. Share this with friends if you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. And thank you very much. Have a nice Sunday morning.